It was a bright Saturday afternoon when Maria, a 13-year-old girl with beautiful curly hair, went out with her friends. They were heading to the local park in their small town, looking forward to a day of fun. The sun was shining, and the air was warm with just a hint of breeze. The park was a popular spot for young people to hang out, play basketball, and enjoy each other's company. Maria and her friends laughed together, chatting about their week at school and planning what games they would play. Maria had always been proud of her natural, curly hair. It was thick, full of life, and perfectly matched her vibrant personality. Her friends loved to admire her hair, and she took care of it with love, brushing it gently every morning. But today, something was different. As they walked through the park, a police car slowly rolled by. Maria didn't think much of it at first, but the car stopped, and the officer inside got out, walking toward them. He was a tall man with a serious look on his face. Maria's friends, used to seeing police officers in the neighborhood, didn't think anything of it either. But the officer was staring right at Maria. "Hey, you there," the officer called out, his voice loud and commanding. "Come here." Maria turned to her friends, unsure of why the officer wanted to speak with her. Her friends, equally confused, gave her a worried look. "Why does he want to talk to you?" one of her friends whispered. Maria just shrugged and walked towards the officer. The officer didn't smile. He looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. "You," he said, "you don't belong here. You look like you're up to something." His words were harsh and made Maria feel uncomfortable. "What are you doing here?" Maria was taken aback. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just at the park, enjoying a day with her friends. But the officer didn't seem to care. He continued to look at her, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. Maria was confused. She had done nothing wrong. She just wanted to hang out like everyone else. "I was just hanging out with my friends," Maria said softly, trying to explain. "I'm not doing anything." The officer didn't listen. Instead, he stepped closer to her and said, "Take off that headband. I want to see your hair." Maria was even more confused now. She wasn't sure why the officer was so interested in her hair, but she did as he asked and took off her headband. Her natural curls fell freely, framing her face. The officer looked at her hair with a strange expression, and then he said something that made Maria's heart race. "You don't need to wear that. You're not allowed to hide what you really are." Maria didn't understand. She felt uncomfortable and didn't know what to do. She tried to explain again, but the officer wasn't listening. He had already made up his mind, and his words made Maria feel even more uneasy. Maria felt her heart race faster as the officer continued to stare at her, making her feel even more uncomfortable. The sun felt like it was beating down harder, but it wasn't the heat that made her sweat. It was the pressure of the moment. She couldn't understand why this was happening to her. Why was the officer acting so strange? She was just a kid, like everyone else at the park, and she hadn't done anything wrong. Her friends stood in the background, nervously watching, unsure of what to do. Maria glanced at them, hoping they would help, but they were just as confused as she was. The officer had made it clear that he didn't want to listen to any explanations. "You don't belong here," the officer repeated. "I know what you're up to. You think you can just act like everyone else, but you're different. You need to show me what you're hiding." Maria's stomach twisted with fear. She didn't know what he meant by hiding, but the way he looked at her made her feel small and out of place. She had never experienced anything like this before. No one had ever treated her this way simply because of the way she looked. "I'm not hiding anything," Maria said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I'm just here with my friends." But the officer wasn't listening. His eyes narrowed, and he stepped closer to her, his tone sharp. "You don't need that headband," he said, pointing at the small fabric that Maria had worn to keep her curls in place. "Take it off. I want to see your hair." Maria felt a wave of panic. She didn't understand why the officer wanted to see her hair so badly, but she didn't want to make things worse, so she slowly reached up and pulled the headband off. As her curly hair tumbled out, she saw the officer's expression change. But it wasn't a look of surprise or curiosity. It was almost like a sneer, like he was looking at her as if she didn't belong. "You should know better than to try to hide it," the officer muttered under his breath, though loud enough for Maria to hear. "I can see it now. This is what you really are." Maria's heart sank. She had no idea what the officer was talking about. She felt like she was being treated differently, just because of her appearance. The officer's words hurt, even though he didn't say anything directly insulting. It was the way he said them, as if there was something wrong with who she was, simply because of the color of her skin and the way her hair grew. One of her friends, a boy named Kevin, stepped forward. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, his voice shaking. "She hasn't done anything wrong. Leave her alone." The officer ignored Kevin's question, his focus entirely on Maria. "You need to come with me," he said, grabbing her arm firmly. Maria froze, feeling a sense of helplessness wash over her. She wanted to fight back, but she wasn't sure how. The officer was much bigger than her, and she was scared. "I'm not going anywhere," Maria said quietly, trying to pull away. "Please, I haven't done anything." But the officer didn't listen. He began to push her toward the nearby police car, not caring about her protests or the fact that she hadn't done anything wrong. Maria's heart was pounding in her chest as the officer dragged her toward the police car. She didn't know what to do or how to stop him. Her friends were shouting behind her, but the officer didn't seem to care. He kept a firm grip on her arm as he led her away from the park, pulling her further into a small area where no one else was around. It was a quiet part of the town, where only a few people ever passed by. Maria's mind raced. What was going to happen next? Why was he doing this? As they reached the small holding area, Maria felt her knees shaking. She wanted to run, but she didn't know where to go. The officer seemed angry now, more so than before, as if he was frustrated that she wasn't following his orders without question. "Sit down," the officer ordered, pointing to a chair in the corner of the small space. Maria hesitated for a moment, then slowly sat down, her eyes still wide with fear. She glanced around, looking for any way to escape, but there was no one nearby to help her. The officer stood over her, glaring at her as if she had done something terribly wrong. "What's going to happen now?" Maria asked quietly, her voice trembling. She had tried to stay calm, but it was hard to do so with the officer watching her so closely. "You're going to get rid of that," the officer said, pointing at her hair. Maria's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" she asked, confused. The officer's face twisted into a frown, and his words were cold. "Your hair," he said. "You're not allowed to hide it anymore. I'm going to shave it off." Maria couldn't believe what she was hearing. "Shave my hair? Why?" she asked, her voice breaking. She loved her hair. It was a part of who she was, a part of her identity. To have it taken away like that felt impossible. The officer didn't answer. Instead, he took out a pair of clippers from his bag and turned them on with a loud buzzing sound. Maria's stomach turned. She didn't want to lose her hair, and she definitely didn't want this officer to do it. "No, please," Maria begged, standing up quickly. "Please don't. I haven't done anything wrong. I just want to go home." But the officer ignored her pleas. He moved closer and grabbed her head, holding it still as the clippers buzzed to life. Maria closed her eyes, feeling the cold metal of the clippers against her scalp. She tried to pull away, but the officer was too strong. As the clippers shaved her hair, Maria's thoughts raced. Why was this happening? Why was this officer so cruel? She felt a deep sense of sadness and anger rise within her, but there was nothing she could do. Her hair, which had always made her feel proud, was now being cut away. The officer didn't seem to care that this act was humiliating her. He was doing it simply because he could. When the shaving was finally over, Maria's scalp felt exposed and raw. The officer stepped back, looking at his work with a satisfied expression. Maria touched her shaved head with trembling hands, her eyes filling with tears. Her once beautiful curls were gone, and she felt a deep sense of loss. But this wasn't the end. Something was about to change. Maria didn't know it yet, but this moment would lead to something bigger, something that would challenge everything the officer believed in. Maria sat in the small room, her hands shaking as she touched her bare scalp. She couldn't believe what had just happened. Her once full, curly hair was now completely gone, shaved down to the skin. It felt cold and strange against her fingertips, as if she had lost a part of herself. Her tears came slowly at first, but soon they were falling freely. She had never felt so vulnerable in her life. Her mind kept replaying the events over and over. The officer had been so harsh, so rude, and he hadn't even listened to her. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply been at the park, spending time with her friends, enjoying the day. But none of that mattered to the officer. He had targeted her, humiliated her, and taken away something that was so important to her. Her hair wasn't just something to cover her head. It was a symbol of her identity, her culture, and her pride. Losing it like this felt like losing a part of who she was. Maria sat there for a long time, staring at the floor, too upset to speak. The officer had left the room, and she was alone. Her friends had been left outside, unable to help her. She thought about them, her friends who had been so kind and supportive until now. She wondered if they would even recognize her when she walked out of this place, now that her hair was gone. It felt like the officer had taken more than just her hair. He had taken her confidence, her comfort, and a piece of her spirit. After a while, Maria stood up slowly, wiping away her tears. She knew she had to go back to her friends, but she didn't know how she would face them. She was scared they would look at her differently, like the officer had. Her friends had always admired her hair, and now it was gone. Would they still see her the same way? As Maria walked out of the small room, her heart was heavy. The officer was standing nearby, watching her with a cold expression. Maria kept her head down, avoiding his gaze. She didn't want to speak to him anymore. She didn't want anything to do with him. Her friends were waiting outside, looking anxious. When they saw Maria walking toward them, they froze, their eyes wide with shock. For a moment, no one said anything. Maria could feel their gazes on her, their surprise and concern in the air. One of her friends, Kevin, stepped forward. "Maria, what happened?" he asked softly, his voice filled with sympathy. Maria tried to smile, but it felt forced. She couldn't look at Kevin without feeling the weight of what had just happened. "It's okay," she said quietly, even though she didn't believe it. I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. Far from it. Inside, Maria felt broken, as if a part of her had been ripped away. Her hair was gone, and she wasn't sure if she could ever feel the same again. She felt exposed, like the officer had stripped away her sense of identity and replaced it with nothing. Maria's friends surrounded her, offering their support, but the pain still lingered. She was unsure how to move forward. She wanted to believe that things would be okay. But at that moment, it was hard to see any way out. The officer had done something that went beyond just shaving her head. He had made her feel like she didn't belong. This part focuses on Maria's emotional response to it. Maria's head felt light as she walked home with her friends. The weight of what had happened still hung over her, but now there was something else, something she hadn't expected. Her father. She hadn't told him yet, and as the hours passed, she began to realize how important it was that he knew what had happened. Her father had always been there for her, supportive, kind, and strong. He was someone who fought for justice, someone who had taught her to always stand up for what was right. But now, Maria didn't know how to explain what she had been through. She had heard her father speak at community events many times. He was a well-known lawyer, respected in their town for his work, helping people who had been wronged. He had worked on cases that changed the laws, fighting for fairness and equality. People looked up to him for his wisdom and strength. Maria always felt proud of him, but today, she wasn't sure how to tell him about the officer's actions. Would he be as angry as she was? Would he know what to do? When Maria finally got home, her parents were sitting in the living room. Her mother looked up and smiled when she saw her, but her smile faded as soon as she saw Maria's shaved head. Maria's mother stood up quickly, her face filled with concern. "What happened?" her mother asked, her voice soft, but filled with worry. Maria opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. She couldn't say it out loud, couldn't explain how the officer had treated her. She just couldn't find the strength to tell her mother everything. Her father, sitting in the chair next to her mother, also looked at her with concern. His expression was unreadable, and for a moment, Maria wondered if he had already guessed what had happened. Her father stood up slowly, walking over to Maria. He placed his hands gently on her shoulders and looked into her eyes. "Maria," he said softly, "tell me what happened." Maria looked at him, and for the first time that day, she let herself break down. The tears flowed again, this time uncontrollably. "I didn't do anything wrong, Daddy," she said between sobs. "I was just at the park with my friends, and the officer, he made me shave my hair." Her father's eyes widened as he listened. For a moment, he didn't say anything, his face frozen in shock. Then, his expression turned to one of deep concern. He knelt down in front of Maria, taking her hands in his. "Maria," he said softly, "I am so sorry this happened to you." Maria could see the sadness in her father's eyes, but she could also see something else. Determination. Her father had a way of standing up for people who needed help. He didn't back down from a challenge. And in that moment, Maria realized something important. Her father wasn't just her dad. He was someone who fought for justice, someone who would make sure that what had happened to her would not be forgotten. "I promise you, Maria," her father said, "we will make sure this officer faces the consequences of his actions. No one should ever treat you like this." Maria's heart began to calm as she listened to her father's words. She felt a sense of hope return. She wasn't alone in this. Her father was going to fight for her. The moment Maria's father heard what had happened, he knew something needed to be done. He wasn't just upset for his daughter. He was furious that an officer had treated Maria so unfairly, simply because of who she was. He had fought for justice many times in his career as a lawyer, but this time, it felt personal. He couldn't let the officer's actions go unnoticed. The very next day, Maria's father started making calls. He contacted people in the legal world and reached out to community leaders who could help support the cause. He knew it would be hard to fight the police, but he had seen corruption and unfairness before. He also knew that Maria deserved justice, and he wasn't going to let the officer get away with what he had done. Word about Maria's story spread quickly. News outlets began to pick up the story, and soon, the whole town was talking about the officer's actions. Many people were outraged by what had happened. They couldn't believe an officer, someone who was supposed to protect and serve, would treat a young girl like this. Rallies and protests were organized by local community groups, demanding accountability for the officer's actions. Maria's father, though busy with legal work, made sure to keep his daughter involved. He wanted her to know that her voice mattered, and that together they could make a difference. He spoke with reporters, sharing how Maria's rights had been violated. He made sure people understood that what happened wasn't just about a shaved head. It was about the officer's disrespect for Maria as a person, simply because she was black. Maria, still struggling with the emotional toll of the experience, began to find strength in the support from the community. As more people learned about what had happened to her, she realized that she wasn't alone. The anger and sadness she felt were shared by many others, and that gave her the courage to speak up. She agreed to give an interview to a local news station, where she told her story for the first time. "I never thought something like this could happen to me," Maria said in front of the camera, her voice shaky at first, but growing stronger as she spoke. "I was just at the park, having fun with my friends. I didn't deserve to be treated like that. No one does." Her words touched many people, and soon, people from all over the country began to offer their support. They wrote letters, signed petitions, and shared their own stories of experiencing unfair treatment. It became clear that what had happened to Maria was not an isolated incident. It was a reminder of the ongoing struggles that many black people face every day. The officer, on the other hand, was starting to feel the pressure. His actions had sparked outrage, and the police department could no longer ignore the public outcry. There were talks of an internal investigation, but many people in the town wanted more than just an investigation. They wanted real action. They wanted justice. Maria's father kept pushing forward, confident that change was possible. As the community continued to rally behind Maria, he knew that the fight was just beginning. And this time, they were going to make sure that the officer understood the consequences of his actions. As the days passed, the officer who had shaved Maria's hair began to feel the weight of his actions. At first, he didn't think much about what he had done. He had always believed he was just doing his job, following the rules. But now, things were different. The story about the young girl and the officer who had shaved her hair was everywhere. People were talking about it, sharing their anger and disappointment on social media, and it was all over the news. The officer began to realize that what he had done wasn't just a mistake, it was wrong. He could hear the voices of the people who were protesting, the families who were speaking out, and the faces of people who had been hurt by his actions. It felt like the whole town was turning against him, and he couldn't escape the pressure. The more he thought about Maria, the more he understood how much pain he had caused her. He had made her feel small, and he had taken something from her that she could never get back. One evening, the officer sat alone in his apartment, watching the news reports about the protests. He saw Maria, a young girl no older than his own daughter, standing up and speaking out about what had happened. She was brave. Her words were clear, and they carried the weight of everything she had experienced. And as the officer watched her on television, something inside him shifted. He felt a deep sense of regret. "I can't believe I did that," he muttered to himself, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. He had never thought about the consequences of his actions. He had never thought about the pain he was causing the people he was supposed to protect. All he had seen was a young girl, and his own biases had taken over. He had let his prejudices cloud his judgment, and now he had hurt someone who didn't deserve it. The officer began to think about Maria's father, a well-known lawyer who was now fighting for justice. He had heard of him before, but never in this context. The officer now realized that the man he had wronged was someone who had worked his whole life to make the world a better place. He was a father, just like him, and yet he had taken away the dignity of his daughter without even thinking twice. "I need to fix this," the officer said quietly, a sense of guilt washing over him. He knew that apologizing wouldn't make things right, but it was the only place to start. He needed to face Maria and her family and admit that he had been wrong. The officer made a decision that night. The next day, he would reach out. He would meet with Maria's family and offer a sincere apology for the pain he had caused. He didn't know if it would make a difference, but he knew it was the right thing to do. As he prepared for the meeting, the officer thought about the lessons he had learned from this experience. He realized that it wasn't enough to just apologize. He needed to do more. He needed to take responsibility for his actions, learn from his mistakes, and make sure something like this never happened again. The officer, now filled with a heavy sense of regret, knew that he couldn't undo what he had done. But he also understood that taking responsibility was the first step toward making things right. He had seen how his actions had hurt Maria, and he knew that his apology couldn't change everything, but it was necessary. He had to face the truth and make amends. The following morning, he reached out to Maria's father. He called the number he had from when he had first heard about the case. His hands trembled as he dialed the number, unsure of how the conversation would go. When Maria's father answered, the officer felt a weight lift off his shoulders. There was a long pause before he spoke. "Mr. Thompson," the officer began, his voice quiet but sincere. "I'm the officer who was involved in the situation with your daughter." He took a deep breath. "I want to apologize for what happened. I was wrong, and I hurt your daughter. I can never take back what I did, but I want you to know I regret it deeply." On the other end of the line, Maria's father was quiet for a moment. The officer could tell that Mr. Thompson was processing what he had just said. Then he spoke. "I appreciate you reaching out," Mr. Thompson said calmly, but the officer could hear the tension in his voice. "This is a step in the right direction. But it's not just about words. It's about actions. If you're serious, you need to show that you're willing to change and learn from this mistake." The officer nodded, though he knew that Mr. Thompson couldn't see him. "I understand," he said. "I want to meet with you and your family. I want to apologize to Maria in person. I know it's not enough, but it's the only thing I can do right now." Mr. Thompson took a long pause before responding. "We'll meet with you," he said. "But this isn't just about an apology. This is about making sure nothing like this happens again. We'll need to see real change from you and the department." The officer agreed. He knew that his apology couldn't be the end of it. He understood that real change meant taking responsibility for his actions and making sure he never treated anyone that way again. He also knew that there needed to be real consequences for what he had done. He was willing to do whatever it took to help fix the wrongs he had caused. Later that afternoon, the officer arrived at Maria's home, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never felt so nervous in his life. When he walked in, Maria's parents were sitting in the living room, and Maria was there too. She was quiet, watching him with a mix of curiosity and uncertainty. The officer took a deep breath before speaking. "Maria," he said, his voice shaking, "I'm so sorry for what I did to you. I treated you horribly, and I understand that no apology will ever take back the pain I caused. I just want you to know that I am truly sorry. What I did was wrong, and I am committed to making sure nothing like this happens again." Maria looked at him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then slowly she nodded. "Thank you for saying that," she said quietly. "It means a lot to hear you say it." The officer felt a weight lift from his chest. It wasn't the end of the journey, but it was a beginning. He had taken the first step, and now he was ready to make real changes in his life and work to make things right. The days after the officer's apology felt like a turning point for everyone involved. Maria, though still deeply affected by the experience, felt a small sense of relief. She wasn't sure if she could ever forget what had happened to her, but hearing the officer's apology had brought her some comfort. It was the first step toward healing. But it wasn't the end. There was still a lot of work to do. Maria's father, who had been pushing for justice from the very beginning, wasn't going to let this matter be settled with just words. He knew that an apology, no matter how sincere, couldn't erase the damage caused. The officer had to show through his actions that he was truly committed to change, and Maria's family wasn't going to stop until they saw that happen. The officer, for his part, had started attending anti-racism and sensitivity training. He realized that his own biases had affected his actions, and he was determined to learn from his mistakes. He met with leaders in the community and listened to their stories. He knew it wasn't enough to just apologize. He needed to become part of the solution. He also worked with the police department to push for changes in how officers were trained to interact with people from different backgrounds. He hoped that by working together, they could prevent something like this from ever happening again. At the same time, the town was beginning to see positive changes as well. The story of Maria's experience had sparked conversations about racism, justice, and how people should treat one another. People from all walks of life came together to support Maria and her family. They realized that Maria's story was part of a bigger picture, one that showed how important it was to stand up against injustice and make sure everyone was treated with respect, no matter their background. In the months that followed, Maria's hair grew back. It was different now, not just because it had changed in length, but because it carried the weight of everything that had happened. Every curl, every strand felt like a reminder of the strength and resilience she had discovered within herself. Her family was proud of her, and they could see the change in her too. Maria wasn't just the young girl who had been hurt by the officer's actions. She was a symbol of courage, standing up for herself and for what was right. Maria continued to share her story with others, speaking at community events about the importance of standing up to injustice. She wanted people to know that even though something painful had happened to her, it didn't define her. She was more than just the incident. She was a young girl with a bright future, and nothing could take that away. As for the officer, he knew he still had a long way to go. He wasn't perfect, and he wasn't going to pretend that everything had been fixed overnight. But he had made a start, and he was committed to making things right, both for Maria and for the community he had sworn to protect. The story of Maria and the officer didn't end with the apology. It ended with change. Real change that would hopefully make the world a little bit better, one step at a time.